Welcome back. In this lecture, I want to look at three major Protestant theologians whose thought about evil was profoundly influenced by, but also in some important ways, profoundly shaped the reception of other people's thinking about World War II and the implications of World War II for thinking about the place of evil in the Christian narrative. For World War II did not only challenge non-theological thinkers and philosophers like Camus. If anything, its challenges to traditional religions was even more profound. And the thinkers in those traditions did respond in profoundly creative and innovative ways. We'll see that in the next several lectures. The 20th century Protestant thought on evil has been rich and diverse. In this lecture, I want to look at three particular versions of thinking about how to relate evil to Christian understandings of grace, for that's a big problem for all of them, how that is to relate a serious assessment of evil, especially in the wake of the Second World War, to the good news of the Christian gospel, which seems to undermine the seriousness with which we ought to understand evil itself. The basic problem any Christian, especially Protestant thinker, faces in thinking about evil is pretty simple. If evil is something we can know and proclaim now, as the gospel demands for Protestant Christians, is finally overcome by God, how can we take it seriously as a challenge we have to confront today? And does the message of that good news really seem plausible to us after all the evil we have confronted in the world in the past century or so, especially for these thinkers after all the evil that has just occurred in the Second World War? Now, this general field of uneasiness for Christian theology can be rendered more specific in two concrete questions. One is a challenge that pretty secular or even anti-theological thinkers like Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, maybe Conrad, maybe Camus, can ask, and that is, can Christianity ever really take evil seriously enough? That is, for thinkers like these, a lot of Christian theology does not really confront the wholly abyssal character of evil, the terrible bottomlessness of evil, the way it seems not to be framed by a good universe or a good God. The Christian gospel to these thinkers can seem simply to pour an oversweet syrup of how God is good and Jesus loves you all over the real, jagged, broken glass ugliness of our world. The gospel to thinkers like this, these anti-theological or rigorously secular thinkers, can seem desperately optimistic, over-optimistic, as if it's trying to overcompensate for the challenge of evil. The second kind of specific question to keep in mind as we're going through these guys is a more precise challenge, the challenge of the 20th century itself. Can Christianity take our age's evil seriously enough? Do the theologians of the age themselves manage to show how Christianity can grapple with the problems our world faced in that bloody century? Now here we'll see the three thinkers we look at answering this question in quite different ways. And in interesting ways, they answer it because they work out of slightly different starting points to think about evil. Paul Tillich, as we'll see, starts to think about evil through thinking about the experience of aesthetic encounter, of encountering something and realizing there's more there than you initially thought. Karl Barth thinks about evil in light of God's salvific action to save the world and redeem the world, and in some ways thinks about evil in terms of God's providential sovereignty over the whole world. Really, evil's a part of that story for Barth. And then Reinhold Niebuhr really thinks about evil as a kind of anthropological puzzle that has a bearing on our experience of things in the world, our aesthetic experience of beauty and things like that, has a bearing on God's plan for the world, but is really fundamentally a human phenomenon that we need to think about in human terms. So let me begin with Paul Tillich. Now, Tillich is a German Lutheran theologian who is trained in classical German style, but who moves in surprising ways as a theologian once he reaches maturity. He was in World War I a chaplain in the Imperial German Army, very academic chaplain, but nonetheless a chaplain still. And as effectively a 30-year-old, he survived the World War I Battle of Verdun, which was a charnel house, a battle in which roughly about 1 million Frenchmen and Germans were killed in a few square miles of mud over the course of about 9 months. He came back to Berlin after the war, and he began to be a very important theological and philosophical voice in the interwar years in Germany. But his opposition to the Nazis drove him out of Germany, from which he fled to the US, and he taught basically from the 30s until his death in 1965 in the United States. He wrote a number of very important works. He was a very influential thinker, both for academics and for the general public in the mid part of our century. But for our purposes, the powerful essay he wrote on the demonic as a phenomenon of moral and religious life is really where we're going to look. This essay explores what he thinks of as the experienced positivity of evil. The positivity there, I mean the reality, the real presence of evil. The demonic is Tillich's way of talking about this positivity, while he roots it in the fundamental facts of reality itself. So evil here, for Tillich, is not an accident introduced by the human fall in any way. In some important way, it's an intrinsic part of creation as such. It's a little bit like the combat myth, really. He wants to capture the experienced reality and presence and genuineness of evil that the combat myth captures so well. But he doesn't want to go all the way with that myth, right? He doesn't want to suggest that there's actually a demonic opposition to a divine God that is a rival to that God. That's not his point. His point is that the demonic is in some ways our recognition that reality itself has this dimension of overflowing that troubles and threatens us in powerful ways. The demonic is, for Tillich, a perversion of creativity itself. That is, it's a way in which the creativity that is the world's basic principle, in some way, can in fact go wrong in threatening and terrifying ways. Sin, then, for Tillich, is not just a sloth or a lassitude or despair or falling back into weakness or anything like that. It's a real, active, dynamic, earnest energy. Evil is not simply an absence of good. It's not simply ignorance. It has its own positive givenness. And the demonic exists as the most potent form of that givenness of evil, as a tension between creative and destructive powers at the base of reality itself, right? So Tillich is German, he's trained in philosophy and theology, so he's going to go very abstract on you. And we got to just expect that, have the right medicine, strap in the right way in the chair, and just get used to it. But what he does with this notion is really interesting, so just follow me here for a second. All reality for Tillich has form. Things manifest themselves to us. They give themselves to us in certain forms. This has the form of a tie, right? Before it's cut and shaped into the fabric of a tie, the tie looks just like a piece of fabric on a table or something, but it's given the form of a tie. The demonic appears when the forms of reality, each of them individually or one of them in particular, is consumed. A form is consumed by what Tillich calls the transcendent depth of reality. That is, when the forms in which we understand reality, through which we understand reality, reveal themselves to be unable fully to contain the reality that they capture and deliver to us. We see the object, but the object suddenly seems far more than just an object, more profound than that, something far more deep than the thing itself is that we had heretofore grasped it as being. Let me give you an example that's not a tie. So we sit on chairs all the time, but sometimes if you're in a store, or maybe better, if you go to a woodworking shop, a place where there's carpenters working, and you see a chair that's just been finished, nicely sanded down, beautiful wood chair, maybe it's stained, so smooth, and it's just sitting there waiting to be delivered to some customer or something. sometimes you see more than an object to sit on. You see a beautiful thing. Right? Quaker chairs are just lovely things. If you've ever seen a Quaker chair, a handmade wooden chair, just beautiful. And it's a thing that's not just beautiful because of human artifice, but it's made of wood from a tree that was living, a transformation of one thing into another reality. You see all the ways that nature and sunlight, water, brute muscle, delicate surgical craft all went into making this beautiful chair. And how so much more than just a chair this actually is. I mean, sometimes when I see a piece of beautiful wood furniture like that, it genuinely can look like it should be a piece of art, not a utilitarian device just for my butt, right? And Tillich wants to say that in seeing all that, in apprehending it, not so much grasping it, but grasping how the chair is, in some sense, ungraspable as merely a chair, how much more it is than that. In seeing all that, we begin to experience a vertigo about reality and about all the ordinary ways we rely on reality not to surprise us, to veil its full presence from us so as not to overwhelm us with its bare there-ness. It's that capacity of reality to overwhelm us, which for Tillich is evidence of the demonic. I can well remember one time when I was 15 or 16, and I was walking outside in a field. It was a field on a crisp New England day, and I, for some reason, had to take off my glasses to wash them down, to rub them down. And as I took them down, I looked up again, and I realized that I wasn't seeing just within the frame of my glasses. I was seeing the parts of my vision that my mind just didn't pay attention to. And suddenly the world appeared far vaster than it had ever appeared before to me, or at least recently, since I had glasses. And I remember being overwhelmed by the width of the world in some way. That's sort of what Tillich is talking about, but not just the width of the world, the depth of the world, the idea that beneath everything there is still more. The thing about the demonic is that experience is given to us in the demonic as kind of threatening of our ordinary life. The demonic here is especially visible, or experienced anyway, in human personality, which can remain recognizably itself, yet be possessed by a power beyond itself, right? People talk about actors being possessed when they're doing things, or people talk about athletes being, possessed by the game in some sense. The demonic here is a version of this kind of possession. It's experienced from the inside as a realization that I am far more than just the ordinary me I take myself for most of the time. Just as the chair speaks of depths of reality beyond an object suitable for merely sitting on, so much more do I contain depths of reality beyond what I ordinarily access of myself. I am in some important way far greater than me. And that's a terrifying thought, or it can be. Not just if you're playing soccer or something, or football, but also if, in some important way, you discover that you have an ability to move crowds of people, or to convince students in your class of certain things, or to take control of a meeting and control the way that people understand what's going on in the meeting so that your will is done there. These accounts of the demonic offer a theological picture of evil that acknowledges evil's reality for Tillich, but offers no immediate promise that humanity can triumph over it. For Tillich, the demonic is both subpersonal and yet genuinely engaging of the personal, genuinely something that you do. It's both you and not you. In a way, as I said, there's a way that the demonic is kind of structurally identical to the state of grace, to the state that the ancient Greeks actually called the daimonic. That is, the state of being possessed by a daimon, or a spirit. Here, what Tillich is trying to get at is the phenomenology of both being possessed or of seeing something that is itself and more than itself at the same time, of seeing a thing possessed. And the aim is really just to express this experience of being recognizably one thing, but also so much more than that. Now, for Tillich, if this is the demonic, this experience of not so much me going away, but the trap door at the psychic base of me opening up to reveal the abyssal depths beneath me. If that is the experience of the demonic, for Tillich, grace is in some way, the response to evil is in some important way, the reconciliation or the healing of this abyssal character that we've discovered in our existence. It changes our visage of this, our experience of this bottomlessness, from one of terror and threat to one of comfort and assurance. It challenges us to see that what we thought of as terrifying is actually not terrifying, but in fact a comfort, that we are connected in profound ways to the infinite and ever tumultuous, ever burbling ground or foundations of our own being. For Tillich, famously, grace teaches that each person is accepted by this ground, that our experience of ourselves as I is but one manifestation of this larger force of being, manifest in all things, and that as such we're part of this greater cosmos, the great drama of being. This hopefully helps us understand ourselves, not as needing to justify ourselves or prove our existence as real, a temptation that Tillich sees as lying at the base of our susceptibility to act out of our experience of the demonic in sin, right? This experience of our bottomlessness always threatens us, and so we lash out in certain ways to convince ourselves we are one thing rather than another. This is the terrible prompting of evil for Tillich. And instead, what grace gives us the ability to do, in some sense, is see not that we are bottomless, not that there's nothing below us, but that we are just the top of this larger structure of being that goes on beneath us infinitely. As Tillich's greatest theological sermon said, you have to come to see that you are accepted. This is Tillich's great line. You are accepted. So Tillich offers a picture of evil as substantial, as the appropriation of the self, of its bottomlessness in a fearful way. But it's an appropriation that's positive. It's not a good thing, right? It's not positive in that way, but it's a genuine presence, not simply an absence. Now, mostly he does this in order to capture the experience of being possessed by positive power that he sees as part of what demonic reality is. Two things to remember here. First of all, remember that Tillich was a Lutheran theologian. For him, as with Luther, the experience of evil is something that the devil seduces you into, does not compel you to do. There's a way that being possessed here gets at the genuinely you character of the evil act, the way that you are the one doing it, while also getting at the experience of this evil as something alien to your true being. It's one thing about Tillich. The other thing to remember is, this is a guy who lived through infantry combat in the First World War. And there almost certainly were instances in assaulting a trench line or something like that where he probably felt or definitely saw people engaged in a kind of possession of themselves, which struck him as profoundly demonic. Never forget the history of these people. Tillich is not talking in merely abstract ways, although he is very much an abstract German professor in his own relatively odd way, but we don't need to get into that. He's talking about experiences that were very close to him. He's not just making this stuff up. Okay. Now, to move from Tillich to Barth is really to change registers of thinking theologically. Tillich is a philosopher, a profoundly existential thinker, a brooding thinker in some ways. Barth is a Swiss Calvinist theologian whose first reflex is always to move very strictly to thinking about God, to thinking about theology. Barth is wonderful in terms of exploring how to think about the negativity of evil, if Tillich is useful for thinking about the positivity of evil. Barth's a Swiss Calvinist theologian. He was born in 1886, roughly Tillich's time. He dies in 1969, almost exactly contemporaneous with Tillich. Some consider Barth the greatest theologian since John Calvin, full stop. Catholic, Protestant, Eastern Orthodox, what have you. I'm actually among those who do. He worked a bit after World War II in Germany. He was a professor in Germany, but when the Nazis came to power, he was a profound opponent of them, and so he was kicked out of Germany, and he went back to Switzerland, where he taught at the University of Basel for the rest of his life. He was one of the earliest opponents of the Nazis, actually, among religious folk, but almost entirely for theological reasons. Before he became a professor of theology, he was also a pastor with definite socialist leanings. He's famous for saying that pastors need to read to do theology with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. Now, when it comes to evil, Barth is a really strange character, and a lot of Barth's scholarship is still struggling to figure out what to do with his understanding of evil. He described evil and sin as grounded in, quote, the nothing, unquote, that God has refused explicitly to create. That's very strange, and his vision of the nothing is profoundly obscure. People are still trying to figure out what exactly he means. Now, in German, the nothing, das Nichtige, this is not simply God turning away from a kind of, in metaphorical terms, God turning away from an abyss of emptiness towards the creation that God will do. It's more that God, it's not like the backside of God in that way. It's more like this is something that God explicitly says no to in some important way. The nothing is something in excess then of human wrongdoing. The nothing is what God has said no to in order to say yes to creation. It is a genuine threat to everything that exists, and it undergirds sin. But more than sin, it is far more frightening than anything we can conjure up. The nothing is in some sense a possible non-creation that God might have created had God been different than the God we think God, than we believe and confess God to be, if I can say that. In other words, God actively says no to the nothing, precisely in positively creating the something that is creation, and creating the something that is creation as a gift to humanity of endless love in God. Right? That's Barth's idea of what creation is. Creation is a theater in which the drama of God's affirmation of and love for humanity will play out. And that's the positive story for Barth. And you've always got to keep that positive story front and center. Right? God's great plan for humanity and the world. But he also says, as a kind of appendix to that plan, you have God saying no to das Nichtige, and also God allowing a few tendrils of das Nichtige to enter into reality. God allows a few tendrils of nothingness, of the nothing, to poke their heads into reality, just so that we know something of what we are not facing, something of what God has chosen not to do. So, Barth suggests, unlike Tillich, that the primary fact about evil is its fundamental irreality. In this way, he's kind of like Augustine, although there are big differences. He retains a Kantian sense of sin's inexplicability, its mysteriousness, but he radicalizes this inexplicability into more than a psychological problem. It becomes a problem for the cosmos, not just for our understanding. It's part of the mystery of God that evil exists at all. Barth is in some ways here going back to and echoing that line of biblical thinking from the book of Job forward, that in some sense, evil is related in some complicated way to the providence of God. And because of that, because evil is in some complicated way related to the providence of God, only the providence of God itself will be evil's final solution. Evil is so bad, Barth thinks, that only a truly extreme action on God's part, in Christ, in the second person of the Trinity, in the Son of God, is that which can guarantee the overcoming of evil and the gracious election of humankind. Now note here, this is interesting. For Barth, God's decision for humanity's election precedes the fall. Remember Calvin. Remember Calvin's supralapsarian double predestination. That is, humans are, in some sense, for Calvin, predestined to heaven or hell before the fall. God has planned everything out in God's absolute sovereignty. Barth also is a Calvinist, but he's a far more hopeful Calvinist than Calvin ever was. He actually thinks that all of humanity is predestined to bliss and salvation from before the fall. But, and that's the way that Barth retains his notion of God's sovereignty, but also tries to understand evil as not something humans do irrespective of or independently of or in rivalry to God, but as part of God's whole drama of creation. God creates evil for humans to fall into in some sense, but then will save them from that. But even though evil is bad, and thus Nichtige is really terrible, Barth affirms that God is greater than it by far. So he tries to emphasize the profundity of evil, only within the context of the greater, though admittedly harder to immediately perceive from time to time, profundity of God's love for and support of the world. The point for Barth, then, is just that evil is only defeated and defeatable by God, and in fact is used by God to demonstrate God's utterly gratuitous, absolutely immeasurable love for humanity. Evil, that is, turns out to be God's fall guy. Now, our third theologian is Reinhold Niebuhr, a thinker who, in important ways, learned immensely from both Tillich and Barth, but also in interesting ways is both splitting the difference between them, but also offering a third way altogether. Now, Niebuhr is a very, very famous American Congregationalist theologian. He lived from 1892 to 1972. Again, pretty contemporaneous with both Barth and Tillich. He was enormously influential in the middle third of the 20th century. With his brother H. Richard Niebuhr, he's really the only American theologian who can stand in comparison with Tillich and Barth since Jonathan Edwards from the 18th century. And Niebuhr is without a doubt the most famous theological voice on evil in the 20th century. He offered an interpretation of traditional Christian visions of sin, one that reformulates that vision, the wisdom of that vision, in a language suitable for modern people, people who are skeptical of the literal historicity of the biblical narratives, dubious of the idea that there ever was an historical Adam and Eve, and scientifically literate in ways that make them doubt a lot of previous theological and religious teaching. He was so convincing in his reformulations of the doctrine of sin, for example, that there actually grew up a group of people called atheists for Niebuhr, people who didn't believe in God, but agreed with his assessment of the human condition as trapped in sin. And Niebuhr famously said that original sin is the one Christian doctrine that is empirically verifiable. If we look around in the world, we see that people are just not good. And he said, this is interesting because it tells us that we can actually learn something about the human condition from this doctrine itself, irrespective of whether or not we buy into all of Christian theology, he thought. So why does sin exist? Niebuhr wonders. He says, sin presupposes itself. It's intrinsic to the human condition as we find it in the world. And yet, it is clearly not something that is the way humans should be. Yet, when we try to inquire as to its origins, we find that it is always already there before us. In any moment of psychological excavation, we look back down inside ourselves for some moment of innocence, we can never find it. For Niebuhr, that gets at this kind of originality of original sin. There's no way to be a human in this situation where sin is not involved. Now, sin is not necessary for humans, Niebuhr thinks, but it is in our current created condition an inevitable consequence of our condition. And normally, Niebuhr thinks sin is typically pride. It's an attempt to overassert our will over reality, because we deny our createdness, our finitude, our smallness, our materiality, and imagine that we are essentially will, pure spirit, kind of something that is unbound by the material finitudes of our reality. Conversely, sin could also be, that's the main theme for Niebuhr of sin. Sin is primarily for him pride, the assertion of the self. But it doesn't have to be that. It can also be a form of what he calls sensuality, a way of only living in our finitude, in our material bodies, without reference to our transcendent hopes and our transcendent longings. Either way, the basic story of sin is the same. Humans are created as finite and yet free, natural and yet also transcending nature. We recognize our hybrid constitution and are made profoundly anxious by it. We don't like being both matter and spirit. And it is that anxiety that inevitably arises in our situation that in turn, that anxiety induces us in one way or the other to be either wholly fleshly and find our whole happiness in material goods, whether that's libertinism or Marxism, or to try to escape that material condition altogether and find our whole happiness in the ascetic escape from the self, denial of the flesh, and denial of finitude itself, as in some forms of religious extremism, some strands of technological utopianism, and, Niebuhr thought, some kinds of democratic utopianism as well. Whether we sin via sensuality or pride, we are attempting most fundamentally to escape this hybrid condition, this condition of being in the tension of both matter and spirit, of being here and yet being able not to be here. And it is precisely that effort to escape, which is in some sense inescapable to our world, to our condition, that is, in fact, sin. Now, grace, for Niebuhr, is the merciful power and knowledge that lets people go forward in responsible moral action, even if they know that such action inevitably stems from sinful persons, sinful characters. Grace is the energy, he thinks, that allows us to go forward in our lives in fear and trembling, knowing our judgment is to come as sinners, but knowing also that God has reservoirs of mercy meant to overcome our sin and heal our broken souls. In other words, the recognition of sin could be paralyzing, Niebuhr thinks, but it's not supposed to be. And God will not let us get off the hook, he thinks, by recognizing and being paralyzed in our sin, like Jean-Baptiste Clément's, Camus' character, was. Sin here is then very clearly a phenomenon of anthropology, a picture of the human. It relates first and foremost to our desire to escape our condition. Like Pascal, and possibly like Kant as well, sin here is in some sense a kind of always a temptation to escape. Now, it's not as focused on the role of God in resolving this problem. For Niebuhr, then, evil, sin, these are anthropological categories first and foremost, part of our created makeup. Not a function of God's creative will, as in Barth, but more a function of the human creation, in some sense like Tillich, but not quite as natural, inevitable, and metaphysically necessary, cosmically necessary, as in Tillich. Instead, there's still an insistence on the accidental nature of evil for Niebuhr, or at least an insistence on evil's accidental nature, even as he struggles to explain that. All right, let me try to wrap this in here. This is a series of views on thinking about evil that have provided and continue to shape the way that many people, not only Protestant Christians, think and talk about evil today. And in seeing this, we see a fairly broad range of ways to think about evil within the context of Christianity. A way related to Luther's insistence that the devil works from within you, in the case of Tillich. A way related to Calvin's doctrine of divine predestination and divine sovereignty, as in Barth. And then Niebuhr's attempt to develop a picture of sin that seems fundamentally an anthropological doctrine, less related to doctrines of God. Next, we're going to turn to another major religious force shaping the way people talk about evil, and that is Roman Catholic thought on evil in the 20th century.